On today's Zoffy, we're going to be talking about hydrogen again. We interviewed Dr. David Lizell from the Transition Accelerator at the University of Calgary last week. So we talked about all the different uses for hydrogen and how it's going to be probably the dominant clean fuel heading into the next decade or two. But then the question becomes, what are some of the applications and how do you get it to market? And what are some of those market opportunities? So to discuss that, we're going to be talking to Maggie Hanna, who is a longtime geologist in the Alberta oil and gas industry, and of late has become kind of a technology guru. She calls herself a technology scout, and this is kind of her bailiwick, and I'm looking forward to the chat. So welcome to the Zoffy, Maggie.
Thank you, Markham.
Now, I'm not sure how to introduce the topic because hydrogen is a story that I'm just beginning to report on. So maybe what I'll do, Maggie, is ask you what your ideas are for what are the applications for hydrogen in, let's say, industry, in space heating like homes, that sort of thing.
Sure. So just to take it a little bit from basics, hydrogen, first element on the periodic table, is not an energy source. It's an energy carrier, right? It doesn't exist by itself on this planet. We have to make it. There's lots of ways to make it. But it's really useful in some of the ways that Markham suggests, because when you use it and you take the energy out of it, it doesn't have any carbon footprint in that process. It just makes water. So it's a way, hydrogen is a way to decarbonize some of the more difficult areas of our society that electricity doesn't do very well. So it's really good for heavy transport trucks, trains. I would say at this point, it's been tried for 2 years and very successfully by Alstom and Snam in Europe, and so passenger trains, freight trains are still coming. Good for buses, good for shipping, good for ferries, and there's a real push to use it for aviation right now. As well, it's really good for home heating and building heating and in industrial kinds of processes like when you make steel, first you have the iron ore, which is iron oxide, and you can use, right now we use metallurgical coal to take that oxygen off that iron. We can use hydrogen, it reduces just the same, but doesn't have, the CO2 footprint so much. And then we could take that pig iron that we made, and now we can make melt it up and add vanadium to it and other things to it for different properties we want in that steel, and we use hydrogen for that. And then the last part of it is we can use hydrogen in that steel industrial process as we heat it up and we roll it into the sheets and the tubulars and the things that we make out of it. We use hydrogen for that. So we're working on also cement, and we can't yet get all the CO2 out of the cement, but we can get a good bunch of it out of the cement by using hydrogen instead of natural gas for heating. And so there's a lot of things that hydrogen does really well, that does things better than electricity or heavy battery electricity types of things. It's also good for storing electricity, like from wind and solar plants. And instead of curtailing that wind and solar power, you make hydrogen instead of throwing the electricity away. It makes sense.
Well, Maggie, maybe we should have just a little chat about energy density, because
sure.
In my book, I talked about how the global economy basically is electrifying. It's not going to happen tomorrow. It's going to be decades down the road. But that's the direction we're headed. We're going to electrify transportation. We're going to electrify buildings, and we're going to electrify industry. All of that. We're going to do it with electricity. But batteries are not very energy dense, and that's why gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, and so on has dominated for so long. And hydrogen is also has a very high energy density. Maybe just how high is it? I think I've heard that it's 2 or 3 times that of gasoline. Is that accurate?
Well, not exactly. It depends on whether you're talking about it as by volume or by weight, right? Let's compare it to natural gas, which is kind of similar in its usage. So natural gas, it has 2.5 times the energy density of natural gas by weight. And that's just because it's so dang light, you know? But by volume, it's only about 1/3 of the energy density. And that's because the energy is stored in the hydrogen bonds. And of course, natural gas is carbon and 4 hydrogens, and it stores more, has more hydrogen bonds than H2 does, which just has 1. So it's about 1/3 actually by volume. And of course, when you're moving things by pipeline, volume is what counts, not weight. So as we, for example, if we add hydrogen to a methane line, a natural gas line, we call that hythane, and that will have less energy density, but it will burn immediately cleaner. So if you put, 10% hydrogen into all our natural gas lines here in Alberta to heat your house, you have an immediate 6% reduction in your CO2 footprint. So yeah, that's how that works.
I think that's a very interesting discussion to have, because you see cities like Vancouver that are moving to ban the use of natural gas in new home construction. And there's already an extensive existing distribution system within cities like that for natural gas. And it seems to me that if you can use that distribution system and continue to use furnaces and gas stoves and so on, but shift over to hydrogen, that would speed up the transition, save a lot of money, and just make things, I don't know, it just seems like an easier transition than trying to electrify everything in new home construction, or retrofits as well.
Yeah. So there's some sticky bits to that. First of all, Vancouver has said we're not going to use natural gas anymore. And when you talk to BC Hydro, which I have done, they don't have a hope in hell of providing enough power for that to happen, right? So I've been a proponent of, yes, we're putting in the Trans Mountain Pipeline, TMX. We're going to go to Vancouver. What if we put in a hydrogen pipeline right along beside it? And then a lot of the infrastructure that's already exists can be repurposed to hydrogen. And we in Alberta will keep all of the CO2 footprint here and put it in our geological formations, like forever. Now, the sticky bit, though, is that hydrogen burns hotter than natural gas, and also it has a tendency to leak through metal, especially the kinds of metal that we typically use for pipelines, carbon steel. And so when it leaks through, it actually the hydrogen and the metal ion get together and they make a hydride, which, this is the size of the metal ion and this is the size of the hydride. And so you can imagine that expands and makes a crack in those pipelines. And when all those mini cracks line up, you have a leak. So there's some sticky bits here. And also, if you have let's say your home furnace that runs on natural gas, it can tolerate up to about 15% hydrogen before you have to start swapping out burner tips and things like that. Same with stoves. You want a proper hydrogen stove, though, because hydrogen does burn so hot, it has a tendency to make NOx, which is another greenhouse gas. And it's also, you don't want to be breathing that stuff. So you need a proper hydrogen stove so that temperature doesn't get up that high. Anyway, so there's sticky bits, right? and also the hydrogen or the natural gas distribution in most cities is made out of PET plastic, which is awesome because hydrogen doesn't go through PET plastic, but the distribution, no, the transmission pipelines are carbon steel, and they are susceptible to hydrogen cracking.
Well, you had to know that if there was any kind of a substitution for a fossil fuel, it wouldn't come without engineering challenges, right?
Right, exactly. This is, and people around the world are making this transition already. It's not like we're the first ones to even think about it. It's being done. Like there's, in the UK, there's this company, oh, I can't remember, it's something Bosch. Anyway, they have this awesome hydrogen boiler system for homes. And it can be converted from methane to hydrogen in an hour or back in an hour, that you get somebody in to just swap out a couple parts. And, you know, that's really smart. That's really smart, yeah. And it exists today. We could have it here.
Well, Maggie, let's talk about transporting hydrogen around the country, because you have argued for energy corridors that also include hydrogen pipelines. So just a little background for our attendees. There's a 2016 School of Public Policy, University of Calgary study. I think economist Trevor Tome was part of it. Economist Fellows, I can't remember, Kent Fellows was one of the authors. And it argued for energy corridors linking all of the coast to coast to coast, and explain some of the economics of it. 2017, a Senate committee endorsed the idea of energy corridors. In 2018, then Transport Minister Marc Garneau endorsed the idea. So this idea has been around and getting a little bit of currency. So what's your take on an energy corridor, Maggie, and how would it apply to hydrogen?
Sure. Well, if I was queen of the world, this is what I would do. And that is, I would have an energy corridor from the West Coast to the East Coast. And it would have a bunch of pipelines in it. When you're laying pipelines, the first one is the most expensive, but any other one that you put in that same trench, you save 30% on laying that second pipeline. So, and anyone after that. So let's lay them all at the same time. And we would have a gaseous hydrogen line, a liquid hydrogen line. And I don't mean liquid as in cold. I mean liquid as in an energy carrier that's liquid, like they call them liquid organic energy carriers, or you can move it in ammonia, liquid ammonia. So there's energy carriers for this hydrogen. And so you have a liquid one, you have a gaseous one, you have a natural gas line, you have a hydrocarbon line. We actually have a responsibility to supply hydrocarbons to the world, because this energy transition is happening on the backs of hydrocarbons, whether we like that or not. I mean, I kind of like it, but we have to prepare for the time when, when that's no longer going to be the case. Hence, Alberta, we got to get our poop in a group and get onto this hydrogen thing. So I would say that we also put a high voltage direct current line going both east and west into there. Also, we put in fiber, fast communications fiber, put that in a pipeline and bury all of these things, because we're actually moving into a time with increased weather weirding and higher winds and tornado alleys coming up from the States into Canada. And so if you bury those facilities in the pipes, then they're way more protected than if they're above ground. And also, by having an electrical corridor between the provinces, we set up an electricity trading system between provinces so that we can support each other with power as needed. So, and it's going to be needed, there's weather weirding happening today. So it's.
Well, Professor Tim Weiss was a guest, a Zoffy guest here a few weeks ago. And his opinion was that it makes sense to have an eastern power grid and a western power grid, because putting transmission lines over the Great Lakes through that country is really, really difficult and expensive. Okay, so let's assume that there's two. We could at the very least, have a Western Canadian energy corridor. And I guess there's also the issue of the fact that Hydro-Quebec in particular is already looking at electrolysis generated by hydropower to create green hydrogen. Yeah. And apparently there's a fair amount of excess electricity in Ontario as well that could be used for that. So but still there might be other purposes for an energy corridor, and there's lots, the devil is in the details, I'm sure. But I think the important thing from my point of view is that we at least begin discussing this to see if it's feasible and to build public support for it, and government and political support if necessary. Would you agree with that?
Well, I agree with part of what you say. So, yes, Ontario and Quebec make some of the cheapest green hydrogen around. They can make it. Quebec particularly has free water and low cost hydroelectricity, and they can make hydrogen for $3 a kilogram, right? And we in Alberta, we can make hydrogen with sequestration for less than $1 a kilogram. Now, I think that we should put this right across Northern Ontario and Northern Quebec, right through the shield. We've done it before. You know, it's a little more blasting than digging to get, to lay a pipeline in the ground through Canadian Shield, but we do it. And it's important for Eastern Canada, Central Canada, to have access to both markets. One of the markets is Pacific and the other one is Atlantic. And it's important for the Western Canada Sedimentary Basin. So when I say Alberta, I mean Alberta, Northeast BC, and Southern Saskatchewan, where we have hydrocarbon, we have the rocks to actually sequester CO2. We need access to both markets too. So we really do need this not to be a separate East and West thing. This is sharing pipelines so that everybody gets access to both of these markets that are forming, and they're forming fast. We are dragging our heels here in Canada, right? There's 20 countries in the world that today have hydrogen strategies. We don't have one yet in Canada. We're working on it. We're working on those guys, but I'm hoping by the end of the summer we'll see.
My understanding is that Alberta is supposed to release its hydrogen strategy quite soon, in a matter of weeks, and the federal government is coming late summer, early fall.
Yeah, that's correct.
So once the strategies are out there, and do we need to begin having a public debate about this so that, build public support for it? Or is the fact that governments are prepared to to implement those strategies, is that sufficient?
Well, if you want things to move quicker, you educate people, right? And you support the early adopters who say, yep, here's this. In Edmonton, we're talking about putting in a whole subdivision of housing that is totally hydrogen fed, not natural gas fed. So once people actually see that in action, see that work, with good building envelopes and good insulation and good types of windows, ceiling, and all of that stuff, then people, and how the cost of that energy will go down with that kind of building structures, then people say, well, heck, I want that, So it's a little bit like nuclear, I mean, if I had my way as queen of the world, I'd be putting nuclear into into where these coal plants are. I'd put at least one in there so people can see, run it for a couple of years and people can see, there's no problem with this thing. And this is how much CO2 it saved us. And this is how it's brought the cost of power down. And, it's about socializing people around these kinds of changes. And with hydrogen, the good thing about it is that as with the whole real energy transition is that most of it is going to be in the background. Like people in their homes are still going to turn on the light switch and the lights will still come on, and they're going to drive their cars, but it's going to be hydrogen or electric. I think electric makes more sense than hydrogen for cars. I would save hydrogen for heavy duty types of vehicles. So, you know, it's going to be behind the scenes, most of it. We will have some areas, especially rurally, that are microgrids, where it'll be a little more obvious what's going on. And we've got the AI and the software now to actually moderate all of that. So, you know, that's a little glimpse of part of what the future looks like.
Well, this is going to be the last question, Maggie. So if everybody can, if you want to ask a question, if you could get ready for that and actually put up your little blue hand, then once we're finished chatting about this last question, I'll call on you to ask your question. So Maggie, one of the things that I've noticed is that Europe has got a they're fairly aggressive on these new technologies. China is fairly aggressive on these new technologies. And even though a lot of the political rhetoric that comes out of the White House these days is not supportive, the fact is that a tremendous amount of work is going on in the United States at the state level and at the corporate level and at the startup level to develop and implement these technologies. How is Canada lagging behind? My sense is that we are, but I don't know it well enough, and I was wondering if you have an opinion on that.
Well, I do, oddly enough. You know, 30 years ago, we had Ballard ahead of everybody in the world. And Ballard is like our little jewel, but you have to say, you know, it takes often 10 years from the time you start a brand new spanking new technology till the time it's commercial. And in that time, people need to be paid, and materials need to be bought, and third-party verification needs to be paid for. And that doesn't happen unless there's government support. And it is an investment in the future, and it is critical that we get that right. The States also has an advantage over us, and that is their corporate culture is such that they help out the little startups. You know, I had someone I was helping out up here who needed a certain gas and couldn't get it from anybody here. We got it from the States because they said, oh, you're a startup, I'll send that to you for free, you know? So it's we could use a more generous corporate culture here, and with a different attitude towards startups. It's a hard road to hoe being a startup. You know, you have to have the kind of tenacity that, you know, few of us have. So they're rare.
Well, I can appreciate that. We started online media in 2008.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I get startups.
Yeah. Yeah.
Been on the pointy end of that stick for a while.
Yeah.
And finally, before we get to the attendees' questions, just a final note on the Americans. In the land of free enterprise, the U.S. government and states government spend an enormous amount of money on basic science, on R&D, on commercializing technologies. And there they have an ecosystem that it's an amazing thing, and it's given them a technology edge ever since the Second World War, at least. And we're playing catch up on that. There's absolutely no question in my mind that we are. But I think if we're going to, and by we I mean Canada, if we're going to be competitive in the emerging energy technology world, we need to get on our horse. Time's a wasting.
The horse to get on. We need national labs, you know?
Exactly.
Yeah.
All of that stuff. So that's grist for another Zoffy, and I'd like to get my teeth into that with you know, a little more detail.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
we're going to move to questions now. So Pam Roberts, if you could unmute your mic and ask your question, please.
Hi, thank you, Maggie. Actually, I loved that. That was awesome for me. I did learn a few things, which is amazing. I did a long time ago work a little bit with hydrogen, and the one thing that, as I think about heating homes with hydrogen, the one thing that does make me a little bit nervous, because I know about embrittlement, and is that it is really, really tiny molecule, and it can leak very easily. And I think it has a fairly large explosive limit. And I think, have they solved that? Like, are they just tighter, better fittings, or like, is that a concern in the hydrogen development?
Well, just my opinion, right, Pam? But hydrogen's safer than natural gas. And that's because it is so light and it just goes straight up so fast. If you have an open air hydrogen leak and you blink one time, that hydrogen molecule is already 6 stories up. It's heading for the stratosphere fast. So now natural gas does also head for the stratosphere, but it heads slow. And also hydrogen will leak out of in confined space quicker than natural gas will. And the lower explosive limit for hydrogen is 4%. And for natural gas, it's 5%.
Okay.
So they're about the same. But you know, if I was in a hydrogen car and I was going to have a hydrogen fire, I'd rather be in that car than in a gasoline car, which would consume the whole car. Whereas all you'd get if you had a hydrogen car leak is just like a very skinny flame that went straight up, and your car would be fine.
Yes.
So I prefer it myself.
Yeah.
Well, I can understand Pam's concern. I see her in her living room, and I'm sure she's thinking, if I had that in my stove and there was a leak, what would that do to my house? So, fair question. I'm sure that that we'll be debating this issue as hydrogen.
Oh, I just want to address that for a second, which is nickel steel is hydrogen crack nickel steel.
Okay.
And so there is a pipeline in Alberta that's 30 miles long up in the industrial heartland that's been there for 10, 12 years that moves pure hydrogen, and there has been 0 hydrogen cracking in the pumps, the valves, or the pipeline. So it's costs about 60% more for that material than carbon steel. So it's not cheap, but absolutely doable.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that. Now we're going to call on Dave Patterson. So if you can unmute your mic and ask your question, Dave.
Hi, Dave.
Hi. Very interesting talk. In Australia, they're developing a big energy park, solar and wind. It's going to be like 18 gigawatts. To Asia, Singapore. So is the hydrogen race on? Are they skipping over LNG? What's going to happen with that race?
So Australia is one of the world leaders right now in hydrogen production, and they have done some of the heavy lifting for us. They have, they started with gasification of brown coal and put that hydrogen into a liquid hydrogen carrier ship made by Japan and shipped it to Japan. They're first to do it. They're also the first to ship hydrogen in the form of LOHC, or liquid organic hydrogen carrier. They use toluene to do that. And I think it was Australia that, I'm not 100% confident in this answer. I think it was Australia that did that. It might have been Brunei. But anyway, and they are, I would say their policy and regulatory, they call this liquid sunshine that they are exporting. And they are looking at making humongous solar farms and wind farms to make hydrogen to export to Japan, to Korea. And there's also other jurisdictions around the world that say, bring us your hydrogen. And that's Germany and France and Italy and others. So as Canada, we need access to both sets of markets, the Asian market and the European market, and African market will come along, and so will the South American.
So Maggie, it is, like I can see going, pipeline to Tidewater on the West Coast. It's 1,100 kilometers or so from Alberta, and put it on a ship and send it off to Asia. Shipping it all the way across country to the East Coast strikes me as the economics will be a little more challenged. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so a couple things. One is we have to make very certain that we include and make a point of including Indigenous partnership in both of these pipelines, East and West. And the cheapest way to move hydrogen, move anything that you can in a liquid fluid form, is by pipeline, and it's the safest way. So once that pipeline is in, if I was queen of the world, we'd have federal infrastructure money that would go towards this, and every single province would build their own section of it, and we'd hook it up at the borders, and everybody would get jobs out of this. And at that time, people say, well, I want to take off for the hydrogen to go up here to this industrial district, and someone else would say, well, I want to take off for the power line to go up here. And they would just, we would build it. This is infrastructure money, and dang, this is a pregnant moment right now. And we have a chance, if we're going to have to spend this federal capital, which comes out of our pockets, on something, we better, because we're borrowing from future generations, we better make their life better by spending this capital. And this is one way to do it, actually. I think this West-East energy corridor would be great, because also it would be entirely in Canadian control. Right now, we ship stuff through the States and they say, oh, we don't have room for you. And if we do have room for you, we're going to charge you through the nose for it. It's like, let's stop all that. Let's have our own pipeline, east to west. And yeah, it's going to be expensive. And actually, right now, I'm working with a awesome, brilliant pipeline engineer and designer, Jim Kenny. And I shouldn't say his name, maybe. I didn't ask him, but he's brilliant. And we're just standing up a straw dog right now. Like, what would it cost to put this pipeline in with 8 pipes in it? What was that going to cost? So yeah.
I want to, before we call on Bruce Winter, I want to make a point here, and that is that we need to shift the energy discussion in this country. Right now, I mean, look, I really appreciate, Alberta's hydrocarbon problems and pipeline problems and the difficulties it's having, but are these really fractious conversations we're having about hydrocarbons basically sucks all the oxygen out of the room. And we don't have any oxygen left to discuss hydrogen and other parts of the energy transition. And that, I think, is one thing that we have to solve if we're going to move forward as a country, is we need to have new narratives. We need to be having different conversations than, Jason Kenney beating up on Trudeau over a pipeline. That stuff has got to end, and fairly quickly. So Bruce, if you would unmute your mic and ask your question of Maggie.
And I just want to say to what you said, Markham, is that let's make friends, Friends help each other. Let's make friends. Let's not make enemies. And this whole polarization thing, that gets me, that's my goat. Anyway, go ahead.
And just before Bruce gets to ask his question, we've already got a Zoffy scheduled with Professor Monica Gattinger from the University of Ottawa, the Positive Energy think tank, we will be talking specifically about the polarization of the energy debate in Canada. So you can look forward to that. Sorry, Bruce, we've kept you waiting. If you could ask your question, please.
That's all right. Maggie, I'd like to zero in on a startup called Proton Technologies, which I've talked a little bit about. First of all, they're using, I'm neither an expert in this, they're using, I'll call it steam methane reforming to get at hydrogen, is about the way that they're doing. I'd like your opinion on what their prospects are, what their technology can do.
Sure. So what proton, and they haven't done it in situ yet. So that's the kicker here. They've done all the lab work they can do. They've done all the calculations they can do. They need $3 million they have the site ready to go, but they need $3 million to run the first pilot, right? And that's critical. They are doing an injection of oxygen, pure oxygen, into a reservoir, and that oxygen burns the hydrocarbon that's left over from being produced. When you produce a reservoir, oftentimes you're lucky to get 30% of the oil out. In primary recovery, you're lucky if you get that much. So there's a lot of hydrocarbon left in the ground, and we introduce pure hydrogen into that, and it just lights up like a candle, and it's hot, and you need heat. Like in a surface SMR, we do that with a nickel catalyst at 800 C, right? We can't do it at 800 C, or we're actually going to melt the rocks down there, but we can make hydrogen, and we think, right? We think. So we have to do this. Even though as a geologist, I can see all kinds of things that could go really wrong with this, but we got to do it anyway, because the potential is so high for Alberta. Like, what if we could go into even half of the oil fields that are spent right now, and we could design them to be hydrogen reactors? This could be an awesome thing, not just for us, but for the world. We do this here, it's going to be picked up around the world. It's Proton is innovative and doing all the right things. They just need $3 million.
Just a point. I was on Proton's site the other day, and if I remember correctly, so Maggie said that we can produce hydrogen for under $1 a kilogram in Alberta, and I believe Proton is saying that it thinks it can produce hydrogen for 10 cents a kilogram.
That's right.
So that's the potential here.
Chris, and I'll believe that when I see it, actually.
Yeah, that's what they're saying.
When I see it, there's a lot of there's a lot of unknowns at this point.
But just one more thing, if I could. Way back in your talk, Maggie, you talked about, I'll call it institutional inertia, in terms of getting, seed capital or first stage capital into these things. About 2 weeks ago, Suncor just made a small investment in LanzaJet to do biofuel at $15 million. And you just said a minute ago that Proton needs $3 million.
Yep.
Surely there's $3 million sitting around somewhere in Alberta to actually prove this thing out, not in 3 years, but like right away. So either get on it or get off it. What is the reason that financing can't be put in place?
If I knew, that's a complex thing, right? That when people aren't making investments, it's because they have questions that haven't been answered, or they don't like the pitch, or it doesn't fit their portfolio, or the deal they could make is not appealing to them. There's so many reasons. Nonetheless, I think we should take some of that federal stimulus money and do the proton test. Lots can go wrong and lots can go really right too.
Good stuff. Christopher Wolf, if you could ask your question, please.
Sure. Sorry, I could add a little bit to that discussion around proton. My understanding is that the $3 million is for the hydrogen well that they're working on now. There's also additional investment they need for a oxygen plant. Right now they just use air. So basically it's a tie facility, so it's got the air injection facilities there already. So they'll be doing air for some time, even after they got the hydrogen well popped in the top of the reservoir. My question for Maggie was.
Oh, I just wanted to say, Chris,
sure.
Chris, that's almost right.
Okay.
The well to the top of the reservoir isn't going to cost you $3 million. It is not. But they can put in a small oxygen plant for that amount of money too. So.
Oh, I didn't know about that. Okay. Yeah, the latest quote I got on the oxygen plant was like closer to 50 million for a small oxygen.
For a small one?
Yeah.
No, I don't think so. But
the big one's 450 million.
Yeah. I could be wrong about that, you know.
No, I think it's mainly for the well and some other stuff, but doesn't include the oxygen plant this time, Maggie. I'm pretty sure about that.
Okay, do you have a question for Maggie, Chris?
Yeah, the discussion going around in the Heartland area, is that basically what you mean by the Alberta strategy that's being developed, or is there something else that the government's working on in addition to that?
Both and, Chris. So the Heartland discussion, for those who aren't familiar with, there's been a task force that has been put up to look at how to balance sort of the chicken and egg thing that hydrogen is, right? So what could the markets be from the Heartland if we put in a big hydrogen plant, or even a small one, right? And getting the mayors on side and ministers from the government and scientific experts and environmental people and citizen advocates, and I mean that is a powerful group, and their report is coming out, I think, by the end of July. Now.
August.
Yeah.
Sure.
So, well, they said July 21st, but I say end of July, you say August, we'll see. But it was stood up, that task force was stood up by the Transition Accelerator, and highly recommend you go to transitionaccelerator.ca. It was a brainchild of Caesar and Dave Lazell, who was interviewed last week. And basically it's working on the social side of this energy transition, this hydrogen transition that we're working at. So that's part of your question. And what was the other half again, Chris?
So if there's something else that the Alberta government was looking at for a hydrogen strategy for Alberta outside of the obvious, like the existing hydrogen pipeline you talked about, it's all kind of in the Heartland area. ATCO's got natural gas salt caverns that they're thinking of using for hydrogen, and ATCO had the experience from Australia too that I think they're looking at for that area. So
correct.
That's a lot of good stuff happening in the Heartland areas. Just wondering if maybe there's something also being looked at for Calgary or out, greater Alberta from our government.
Well, you have to. So if you have a hydrogen strategy, you kind of need to map it all out ahead of time, but then you have to go to where the sweet spot is first. And the sweet spot is the Heartland. Why? Because you have a bunch of natural gas lines going there. You need that to make the blue hydrogen. You've got one of the most awesome sequestration formations in the basal Cambrian sand, goes right through there. That's the one that the Shell Quest project uses. It's almost like behaves like an infinite reservoir. And then you have to have storage, and the thickest salts in the province are right there at the Heartland. They're over 500 feet thick. And so ideal for hydrogen storage in salt caverns, which is my favorite way of storing hydrogen, actually. So that's why.
Well, great. That's the end of the Zoffy. This 45 minutes has gone by really quickly.
Where did that go?
Thank you, Maggie, for this fascinating discussion. Before I let you go, or before I let everybody go, if you could follow us on Facebook at Energy Media, follow me on Twitter at PoliticalHam, and we'll be ramping up our Energy Media Twitter account, so you can watch for that. And we'll be also expanding our presence on LinkedIn, so we'll let you know so that you can follow us there as well. Appreciate your support, Maggie. Delightful as always. Thank you very much for this, and we'll look forward to having you on again in the future.
Yeah, you do such good work in this world, Markham Hislop. You deserve support.
Oh, that's very kind of you. Thank you.
No, it's just fact.
Have Have a good one, folks, and we'll see you next week.
Everybody
We'll
for
have
your questions. Awesome sauce.